So what we're doing for the last two lectures, we're going to talk about the respiratory system, and we described anatomically the different parts, and we led up to the point where we got to the lungs. And I didn't talk about this in terms of anatomy because I kind of wanted to start here with the idea that your lungs do not have muscles. Now, it's not entirely true. They do have muscles. They have smooth muscles, but they don't have skeletal muscles. And so the question that we're going to try to address today is, how do we breathe? I mean, it's like this. See, I can do it. But how? Well, it's going to be pressure gradients, but yes, right? All right. So when we talk about the lungs, there's some things you should know about it. First off, it includes those airways, those bronchi, or the bronchi and the bronchioles, which deliver the air to the alveoli, which we talked about. It includes the pulmonary blood vessels. That includes all the arteries, all the veins, including the capillaries. It includes elastic connective tissue, meaning it's very springy, which kind of makes sense, and smooth muscle, and that's it. All right? And this smooth muscle itself is actually surrounding the bronchioles. So really, how do we get the lungs to expand and contract? All right? So that's what our question is going to be today. But before we do that, I think we have, we're going to talk about the pleural sac. And everyone always wonders why we spend so much time talking about the pleural sac. And simply put, what the pleural sac is, it's basically a fluid-filled sac that surrounds the lungs. And every textbook on the planet has this picture of either two balloons, or they'll have a picture of a fist in a balloon. And so the idea here is to show you, okay, here you've got this fluid-filled balloon, and you stick your fist in it, or stick the other balloon, and it wraps around, and so you end up with this double-layered sac that surrounds the structure. And so there's one layer, and then there's the other layer. And so inside that, trying to draw this in there, is where you're going to find all this fluid. And the purpose of this is really to protect the lung as you expand and contract the lung. All right? Because it's going to be moving, and it's going to be moving against other surfaces, and so when those two things move again, they create a certain degree of friction, and so this reduces the friction and ensures that the lung tissue doesn't get damaged. But there's another reason for this structure, and it's because of how it's attached. All right? So if we have this structure, we have to understand that our lungs are actually not attached to the chest itself. Well, instead, what it is it's attached here on this visceral layer. It's attached. And then this portion out here, the parietal layer, is actually attached to the wall of your thoracic cage. All right? Now, again, we're just kind of dealing with some anatomy here to help us understand the bigger picture in the long run. All right? And so inside is fluid that ensures that the tissues do not rub up against each other and get all frictiony and warm and cause damage to them. Now, the muscles that actually do respiration are actually located outside of the lungs. All right, they're found in the thoracic cage, and it includes the diaphragm and then some external muscles that are located within the neck that we're not going to really spend a lot of time talking about. These two here, the scalenus, the sternocleidomastoid. These play a role in respiration in other cases. But mostly what we're talking about is we're talking about the muscles of the ribs, the thoracic cage, and the diaphragm. And these are responsible for allowing you to breathe in. All right? They don't actually act on the lungs themselves. Remember, these are muscles of the thoracic cage, and so when you contract these muscles, they cause the thoracic cage to change shape. All right? When the thoracic cage changes shape, it causes a change in the shape of the pleural sac. It causes it to expand. And when the pleural sac expands, because it's filled with fluid, it doesn't want to expand, and so it drags itself along both sides, and in the process, it drags the lungs. So when you're really breathing, what you're doing is you're changing your thoracic cage. And that's causing a change in the shape of the lungs. Now, the reason we have all this is because, and this is the part that confuses everybody, and so they all throw their hands up. Everyone always, I don't get it. It's too complicated. It has to do with what we refer to as intrapleural cohesiveness and the transmural gradient. It's basically saying that the inside of this pleural sac is filled with fluid, and so it doesn't want to stretch. That's all it means. And I'm going to show you this in just a moment. I want to get through two slides here that are so inappropriately placed, I don't know why I never changed them. I guess it's to try to explain to you all really what respiration is. It's moving gases down a gradient. All right? And so we have to understand that when we breathe in, we're breathing in air. But is that what we want in our bodies? What are we trying to get when we breathe in? Yeah, see, we all took earth science. We know. And then what is air primarily made up of? Nitrogen. Man, this is so awesome. Right? And then carbon dioxide makes up some wee little tiny portion that we measure in like 0.002% or something. It's ridiculously small. In other words, what we're breathing in is a mixture of gases. And while we know that gases have pressures to them, that means when we talk about a mixture of gas, there must be mixtures of pressures within the gas. And so the total pressure of that gas is really the sum of all the little pressures of each of the gases by the percentage of that gas. That was a lot of gas. The example I have up here is just simple. All right, atmospheric pressure, we're just going to use the two major components, nitrogen and oxygen. Nitrogen makes up roughly 79% of atmospheric air. Oxygen makes up the other 21%. All right, just go along with me. All right, so if the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, all we got to do is take 760 millimeters of mercury times the percentage by nitrogen, which is 79%, and that will give us the partial pressure of nitrogen in that gas. And we do the same thing for oxygen, and it tells us the exact same thing. What is the partial pressure of oxygen in the gas? Now, when we breathe in, we're breathing in all of those gases. And so we're talking about changing pressures in terms of bulk pressures, right? But when we talk about moving gases, we look at a specific gas and we ask, which direction is this gas moving? So, for example, if we want to get oxygen in our body, we're going to look at the partial pressure of oxygen in our alveolus versus the partial pressure of oxygen in our blood vessels. And then gases, that oxygen is going to move in the direction where that partial pressure gradient exists. Does that make sense? So we haven't said anything new. We've just made big, complicated words to kind of scare people. Right? This is the time when you can go back up to your physics professor and just, why did you make it so complicated? All right? Now, this is true. Gas moves down partial pressure gradients. This is also true. Gas, when they're dissolved in a liquid, exert the same sort of characteristics we see when they're out in the atmosphere. Why? Because the atmospheric air is a liquid, or you can treat it like a liquid, so it just does the same thing. All right? So the more gas you have, the greater the pressure. It's just kind of important to know. So what we're going to be doing is when we look at these systems down the road, and towards the end of the day, or really more on Thursday, but some today, we're going to be looking at these partial pressures. And partial pressures are always going to be denoted by a big P and then whatever it is that you're actually looking at. So oxygen or partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which seem to be the two that we always focus on. I don't know why. You guys remember this ugly one? Boyle's law? Oh, man, Boyle's law. Boyle's law is real simple. Basically, it says that a constant temperature, pressure, and volume are inversely related. So as pressure increases, volume decreases, and vice versa, right? As pressure decreases, the volume increases. Or you could say it easier. It makes more sense if you say it the other way. If I decrease the volume, what happens to the pressure inside of a container? It increases, right? So it's easier to say it that way. But this principle describes everything that we're going to be talking about. And so understanding these two facts as we move forward is just going to help us understand everything we're going to be dealing with. All right. So here we are with pressure, and we're going to start with the big picture pressure, the atmospheric pressure, intraalveolar pressure, and intrapleural pressure, which are just names to say the pressure out here, the pressure inside my alveolus, and then the pressure inside that little tiny compartment defined by the pleural sac. All right? And so the atmospheric pressure is roughly 760 millimeters of mercury on average. That's what we're just going to live with. I know that's not always true. All right? The intraalveolar pressure is always going to try to equilibrate with atmospheric pressure. All right? That's why our lungs work, is because whenever we change the volume inside our lungs, that pressure is going to try to equilibrate with whatever's out here. All right? And then the third is this intrapleural pressure. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about how this changes, but I'm going to show you why it's important. Because it's this pressure that drives the direction in which our lungs expand or contract. And this is the part that everyone, when you read this stuff, it's like, well, why are we spending so much time on this? And it's easier if I do a demonstration. All right? So I'm going to need a lovely little lung. Who's going to be my lovely little lung? I like females to do lungs. Come on up here, Sophia. And who wants to be a thoracic cage? I need another female. Come on. I told you, you're in the splash zone. You have to come up here. All right. So here's my lung. Nice and lovely. And she likes to be way over here. Who's going to be my thoracic cage? Yeah. Now notice the thoracic cage and the lung are very far apart. Sorry, my hands are freezing. This room is cold. All right. They're very far apart. In fact, during development, your thoracic cage wants to be way over here. Your lung wants to be way over here in the center of your body. All right? And that's what's going on, is that during development that happens, but then we develop that pleural sac. And remember the pleural sac? It sits in between them, and it's attached to. So I need a pleural sac, usually a very strong male who wants to take that role. Come on, somebody come up here. All right. We're going to try to break him. All right. Now, right now we actually have these people set up really well. But notice here's our thoracic cage. Notice it's developed way over there. And notice our lung has developed way over here. But remember, we're trying to connect with our pleural sac. Now, the visceral side of the pleural sac connects to the lung. And see, look what happens. It pulls her slightly out of position. She's not comfortable. And then the thoracic cage starts pulling. Now notice what happens here is that she's slightly out of position, and she's slightly out of position as well. Now, are either of you comfortable? No, and you shouldn't be, because neither is the lung nor the thoracic cage comfortable. All right. Now, this is how it works. Remember, where are our muscles located? They're over here in the thoracic cage. And so when we contract the muscles in the thoracic cage, we pull the thoracic cage out. And look what happens. We pull on our pleural sac. Now, we can try to stretch. We're going to have some fun. Let's try to stretch it. Stretch it. Keep moving. Keep moving. Look, notice what we've done here is we've stretched him as far as he can go. Can we stretch him any further? No. We can't stretch him any further. That's like the pleural sac. There's only so much pressure that can happen as you begin separating these two walls of the pleural sac. The fluid inside can't expand. All right? And no, he can't expand either, right? And so what happens is if I pull on one side where the muscle's located, I can't expand him any further, so he stretches and happens to pull on the lung. And so the lung expands. And then when we relax the muscle, he goes, I'm no longer out of position, and our lung goes back into place. Do you see what we've done here? The reason the pleural sac is important is because it's what we actually pull on. When we stretch or when we contract the muscles in the thoracic cage, the pleural sac has to move. And when the pleural sac moves, it makes the lung move. Does that make sense? Thank you very much. Let's just give them a big... All right? So that's what we're looking at here. When we talk about this intrapleural pressure, all we're talking about is that it becomes more negative because we're stretching that thing further than it wants to be stretched. It can't. It can't go any further, or it can go a little bit further. And so by pulling on it, it causes the contraction or causes the lung to expand. Now, ask your question. Not during normal breathing as far as I know. But let me ask you a simple question. I mean, you've heard about this. If someone punctures the pleural sac, what happens? The lung collapses, right? Why? Because there's no longer something forcing it to get out of position. And so with nothing forcing it to get out of position, it deflates and equilibrates with the environment, right? Yeah. Yeah, well, so out of position. So what I'm trying to say is that, remember, your lung is stretchy, all right? And your lung, and this is what I was trying to demonstrate, is your lung sits way, way over here, all right? It's not attached to the thoracic wall. It's attached to that pleural sac. And so by attaching it to the pleural sac, that actually drags it out of position. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to demonstrate that this is not a comfortable position. The lung is no longer in a position where it wants to be. All right? And even pulling on it even further really puts it out of position. So is it where it wants to be at all? No, it wants to come back over here, but it can't because it's being held in position or out of place by the pleural sac, which is being pulled by the thoracic cage. Right. Now, the muscles involved in the thoracic cage include the external intercostal muscles, which are found between the ribs, all right, and they're on the external side, and the diaphragm. Now, what happens is when you contract the external intercostal muscles, they cause the thoracic cage to expand upward and outward, like so. Now, I always tell you go ahead and feel it, but, ladies always feel real uncomfortable about that. So, ladies, if you're feeling uncomfortable about feeling your muscles, notice here, it's not here, it's here. As you breathe in and out, you can feel your thoracic cage growing in and out. All right? Do it at home. Look at it in a mirror, and you can watch. It's not like when you breathe, it's not going up and down like this. You're really coming like so. All right? And then the other thing is your diaphragm, when it contracts, it doesn't make it smaller like this, push up. It actually contracts and pulls downward, bringing the floor of your thoracic cage down. Well, if you're bringing your thoracic cage up and out, that's getting bigger, and you're bringing this down, that's getting bigger. So what you've done is you've expanded the volume inside the thoracic cage. By doing so, you've also pulled on the walls of the lung, making the lungs expand. And if you make the lungs expand, Boyle's law says pressure goes down when the volume goes up. And so what does air want to do? Exactly. All right? That's inspiration. Now, if you want to know which one muscles the external intercostal muscles are, I highly recommend this weekend going to a barbecue restaurant. Order yourselves up a rib. Not one. I mean, you have to get a rack just to make sure. I recommend, my favorite is actually, I like beef ribs. I know pork rib is more the standard because it's cheaper and easier to get a hold of, but when you get that meat on a stick, it's like a brontosaurus rib. I mean, that makes you feel like a Texan, And that meat that you see along that rib, that's intercostal muscle. All right? And there's actually two. There's an external intercostal and an internal intercostal muscle. And so it's the external intercostal muscles that cause the expansion of the thoracic cage. Now, when we're ready to expire, which is to breathe out, all we got to do is relax those muscles. Because expiration is a passive event. Think about it. What do? When you breathe in, and then when you breathe out, you just relax. All right? And so those external intercostal muscles relax, the diaphragm relaxes, the cage falls back into place, the diaphragm moves back up. That causes the volume inside the thoracic cage to decrease. By decreasing the thoracic cage volume, the pressure increases. If the pressure increases inside the lungs, where does the air want to go? Out. So all this is just basically moving the thoracic cage, which causes changes in the shape of the lungs. All right? You're not doing anything inside the lung itself other than expanding and contracting it based upon you pulling because of that pleural sac. All right? Now, we also have something called forced expiration. All right? Forced expiration is something like this. All right? Now, forced expiration is simple. What did I just do? Did I do something active as opposed to just, there's breathing in and breathing out? That's passive expiration or natural expiration. Forced expiration is when I squeeze the thoracic cage. And this is where two other muscles come into play. Here we're talking about the internal intercostal muscles. All right? What they're doing is they actually pull on the ribs to draw them in closer. And then your abdominal muscles, you can put test it out yourself. Your abdominal muscles are the ones that get all nice and hard. And what they do is they press up on the diaphragm, forcing it up higher into the thoracic cage, basically making the space inside your thoracic cage smaller, driving the air out. So this is an active event. But the same rules still apply. If I increase the pressure inside my lungs, that's going to cause or if I decrease the volume, that's going to increase the pressure. If I increase the pressure, it's going to force the air out. And until that the air inside my lungs is at the same pressure, then when the two pressures become equilibrated, then the airflow stops. I'll say it that way. So far, you all with me? All right. All this slide does is shows it to you instead of my lovely assistants and handsome assistant. Okay. All we're doing here is just showing you. It's like, look, when I pull on the ribs, what have I done? I've pulled on the pleural sac. When I pull on the pleural sac, because this pressure inside here doesn't want to get any smaller, it pulls on this. When that pulls on when you pull on the visceral wall, that's going to pull on the lung. When you pull on the lung, it causes it to expand. And so all you've done is you've changed volume. By changing volume, you change pressure. When you change pressure, it's going to draw air in. And then you do the opposite. It's going to push air out. So far, everyone's with me? Do you see how easy respiration is? It's really, really easy. It's basically straightforward. And looking at this graph, this shouldn't be terribly complex or scary, but some people look at the middle portion of the graph and go, "What? I don't get it." When I have a drop in intrapleural pressure, what that's going to do is it's going to increase the volume inside my lungs, thus decreasing the pressure inside my lungs. So air is going to be drawn in. As air starts filling up, what happens to the pressure inside my lungs? All right, do you see what I'm saying here? I open up, I decrease the pressure, which causes the pressure to drop in my lungs. As air begins to flow into my lungs, what happens to the pressure? It goes up until it balances. So that's why here, even though our pressure is much, much lower, it goes down here inside the alveolus, and then it bounces right back up to where it gets balanced. Right? In other words, as we increase the volume, even though the pressure drops, we bring in air, and so that volume gets filled up. And then we get balanced pressure again. Does that make sense? And then the reverse is true. When I increase the pressure in the intrapleural space, in other words, I compress my thoracic cage, and causing that intrapleural sac to get smaller, allows the lung to relax, which causes the pressure to increase initially. And then as the air begins leaving, then the pressure goes down until it comes back and is equilibrated with the atmosphere. Right? That's all that's going on. And this is just showing you the volume of air moved over the period of time, so it's not so much. But I wanted you to see this because it's not that we're just changing pressure for a moment, and the only pressure that we're worried about is what's going on in the alveolus. That pressure in that pleural sac plays a role. And it's because what we've done is we stretched it where it doesn't want to be stretched, and then we allow it to come back into place. Well, if everyone's getting this, bonus. So I'm going to pause. No questions? Everyone just wants to get home and enjoy the evening. All right. I like this. All right. For those of you who've taken lab, you got to play with this, right? The spirometer. That's where you breathe in the thing and you get to watch your tidal volumes and all the different types of capacities. I'm not even sure why we even teach this in physiology so much, because it's not like we ever talk about its application. But I want to describe a couple things here. And so there are different variations in lung volumes. In other words, there are things that we look at in terms of how you breathe in and out, and we look at that volume of air that's moving, and then we give it names. All right? And so by being a physician, you can use these capacities and these volumes to actually determine, malfunctions in the respiratory system. That's what they're worth for. So anyone here, you don't have to claim that, yes, you have asthma, but for those of you who have asthma, you went and you got this measured, right? Very first time, and the doctor went in, did all his measurements, and then came out and said, okay, you have asthma, this is what you're going to do, and blah, 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 right? I don't know because I'm not a physician and I don't have asthma. And they don't just throw the inhaler at you, though, do they? No, here's an inhaler. No, they figure out, where the deficiencies may lie. All right? And so that's what we're kind of looking at. And so the first thing is that you need to understand that during your period of quiet respiration, you're not filling the lung to its maximum capacity, and you're not removing all the air from the lung. All right? In other words, what you're doing is you already have air that's in your lungs, and you're just moving a small volume of air in and out with every breath. All right? Now, the maximum capacity in males is about 5,800 mils, or 5.8 liters of air. That's how big your lungs are. And females, you're off by maybe 5% off this, so 5,500 to 5,000. Right? And then so during the period of quiet breathing, your volume of air that's in your lungs fluctuates between 2,700 and 2,200 mils. In other words, you move about 500 mils of air per breath. That much. No one can see, so I'm going to lift up your soda. This is how much air you more or less move in and out with every breath. Not too bad, not too shabby. All right. Now, you can force the air out, like the forced. You can do that. No, you can do that and push all the air out, and you still have air stuck in your lungs, and that's still about 1.2 liters of air that still remains inside. And this is beneficial to you. There's a reason why this happens. The reason why this happens is that basically your airways begin to collapse. Remember around the bronchioles, the smallest air passages? It's just smooth muscle. They don't have that cartilage. And so what happens is that when you start pushing air out, that pressure, as you drive the air out, causes them to collapse and the air gets stuck behind in the alveoli behind it. All right? And so it's stuck behind. But the benefit of this is that this ensures that you still get gas exchange. In other words, you're not going through a period of inspiration, bringing air, and then gas exchange is occurring right before expiration occurs. All right? Doesn't matter if you're inspiring, expiring, holding your breath, you're always having gas exchange take place because air is always going to be in your lungs. All right? The other reason has to do with the dynamics of filling up balloons. Anyone here ever have to blow up balloons for a party? Doesn't it suck? I mean, it blows, yeah. Hey, I got it. Uh-huh. No, it does, right? I mean, every time you start off that first balloon, what do? You sit there and you do the stretching because you think that's magically going to make it blow up faster. And then you... I mean, it takes so much energy. But once you get that first puff of air in there, then is it hard? No. And then you tie it off, and then you look at the next one. And you start doing it all over again. What we know, just from our own experiences, is that it's far easier to put air into something that already is partially inflated versus something that is completely deflated, right? Despite the fact that they put that cornstarch in there to make it so that the two sides don't stick together, which we're going to deal with in a minute. Right? Everyone, if you haven't tried this, next time one of your friends has a party, ask to bring over balloons. And you will see what I'm talking about. All right? So, there's two reasons why this occurs, right? One, so we can continue gas exchange, and the other one because we don't have to work so hard to reinflate the alveoli. Now, the different variations in lung supply, yes, I asked a question about this. I apologize that I asked a question about this. I just want you to walk out of here going, yes, I know these names. All right? And it's actually not too terrible. The first is the tidal volume. All right? And the tidal volume is the amount of air that is coming in and out of your lungs during quiet breathing. All right? So that up and down. While you're sitting here right now, that's quiet respiration. So that volume of air, that 500 mils, is what's moving in and out of your lungs. Now, if you wanted to fill up your lungs on top of that quiet breathing, that is your inspiratory reserve volume. So here you are breathing, but if you want to, that's my inspiratory reserve. How much more air can I bring in above that normal tidal volume? And then, the type that I can push out on top of or below, I should say, expiratory reserve. So here I am breathing in, breathing out, and then forced. that last little bit, is the expiratory reserve volume. And then what's left over inside your lungs, that last 1.2 liters, that's that residual volume. All right? So we basically have 4 different types of volumes that we're dealing with. And so there's going to be varying combinations of these volumes. So we have the inspiratorial or inspirational capacity, which is, simply put, your tidal volume and your inspiratory reserve. I think I even have a better picture. Nope. Okay, I don't. So it's basically all this. Oh, look, they've even done it for you. Right there. All right. Then we have the functional residual capacity. That is going to be equal to the expiratory reserve volume and your residual volume. So there it is, right there. And then we have the vital capacity, which is the inspiratory reserve, the tidal volume, and, or sorry, that's not tidal volume, tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve. So basically all the air that you can move in and out of your body at any given time. And then your total lung capacity is adding them all up together. So, is there going to be a question like this? Yes. Do you have to memorize these words? Yes. Is it hard to do? No. You might forget your mother's maiden name, but you can put it into your brains for at least 24 hours. Mm-hmm. They're talking, no, they're actually talking about inside the alveolus. Now, have you ever heard of pleurisy? It's a nasty little fun little thing. And that's basically inflammation in the pleura. So there is a condition where that actually happens. You're just very good at actually exchanging gases a lot better than some of us who freak out thinking that we're going to drown the moment we hold our breath for more than 3 seconds. No, it's just training. It's right. It's actually done up in the brain, in the breathing centers, where you're basically training yourself when and where you need to be breathing in and out. Yeah, you can't expand. I mean, because remember, the volume inside your lungs is dependent upon just your size, right? Now, I had a really close friend who was an Olympic swimmer, or not Olympic. He was actually shy of the Olympic team, but he was. And what he would do is he would see how many times he could do laps with holding his breath, you know, in the whatever the competition pool. I think he got like 3.5 or something like that. Yeah. I mean, and it was just a function of this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing. I'm not thinking about it. It's just all training. Yes.
So when you're training for a marathon or something like that, you're not modifying your lung capacity, such as more red blood cells, better capillary exchange, more capillary.
That's exactly right. Also, musicians. Any musicians play like woodwind or trumpet, stuff like that? I mean, it's the same sort of thing. They can't expand their lung capacity, but they regulate the flow of air, you know, better than they would if they hadn't trained, right?
It also has to do with the oxygen regulating factor.
Yes. So the well, so we're going to talk about how the lungs actually hold on to oxygen and when it actually releases, or I shouldn't say the lungs, when the blood holds on to oxygen and when it releases. So we'll deal with that on Thursday and talk about it more. And actually, BPG is one of those factors that plays a role. All right, on to more interesting things. This is where I get to shake my fingers at the smokers. I'm not really doing that. I'm just going to use you all as an example. So there are 2 different types of aspects of lung or the lung tissue characteristics that we need to kind of take into consideration with regard to lung responsiveness. We refer to a lung as being compliant. We refer to the lung as being elastic. And so compliance refers to how well or how much work has to be done in order to stretch or distend the lung. In other words, how much work do you have to get it to go this direction? And then elasticity or elastance has to do with how well does it return back to its normal shape. All right? So these are the 2 things that we are going to be dealing with. And so the reason I bring up smokers for a moment is because smoking actually has an effect on these 2 different components of lung tissue. And I want to go back to why. Because we talked about it earlier. We talked about barbecue. Now, how does barbecue work? You want to know? Yeah, well, what is it? It's cooking by what? cooking by, smoke. Okay, right. What we say is we go and smoke meat. Right? And in essence, is it the heat that does the cooking here? No. And for those who smoke, is smoke, tobacco smoke or any other kind of smoke, is that smoke hot in the lungs? No, it's not. It's cool. It's basically gotten to body temperature. No, what it's doing is actually, it's affecting compliance by basically causing cross-linking. And that's actually what you're doing here, is you're affecting the meat by cross-linking. If you've ever gotten a nice piece of brisket, and you cut through that barbecue brisket and you look through it and you see that nice little ring, right? That ring is where the smoke penetrated. And it's not a lot of heat. I think you're cooking barbecue at like 250, But what you're affecting is how well the fibers are cross-linked. Now, if they're not cross-linked, they have a certain degree of movement. But when they are cross-linked, they can't move. And so, smokers, I'm just telling you, I'm not wagging my finger to say, stop smoking. You're adults, you can do what you want to do. This is what you're affecting. Now, using elastance for a moment. An easy way to think about elastance, and this will apply mostly to guys, it will not apply to women. Because women, we know that you know how to shop and you know how to get rid of old clothes. Guys, do we still own our underwear from high school? Alright? We do. I own my underwear from high school. Right? And, you go into your drawer and it's like, alright, there's my underwear. That's all I got left. And so you put it on and what happens is you can hear the plastic, the rubber popping in the band, right? And so you stretch that bad boy out as you're getting it on, and then what do you have is you now have this thing that when you let go, it falls down. Now, if you can, alright, for ladies, think about hosiery, socks, because I know you guys get rid of bad underwear. Guys, it's been a joke for centuries that guys don't know how to get rid of our underwear. And that's really what we're talking about, is that elastic recoil is the example that I want to use here that deals with elastance. So when that fails, the lung does not stretch back into place. Yeah. You're not going to ask me about my underwear, are you? Okay. Mm-hmm. That would be, well, no. So think of it in terms of the direction the tissue is going to move. So if I'm trying to increase the volume inside my lung, this is going to be the compliance portion. If my lungs are compliant, they will stretch happily as I expand my thoracic cage. If I have difficulty, if my lung lacks compliance for whatever reason, all right, what's going to happen is I'm going to have to work harder to cause my lungs to expand. All right, and so imagine, a certain population of the people here who are not here, but because you're young, but terminal smokers. When they breathe in, what do you hear? Right? What are they doing? They're working desperately to pull their thoracic cage to draw that volume of air into the lungs because the lungs don't want to stretch. So it takes a lot of work to get them to stretch. And then the other half is, all right, so now that I've stretched my lung, how do I get that air to push out? Because what I'm trying to do is drive the air out. If my lungs don't stretch back into place, I have to force the air out. Right? That sounds horrible. There. So really what we're doing here is we're pushing things in and pushing things out, doing more work than we necessarily need to do. What we should be doing is when we draw in air, it should just be enough to, and then when we relax, it pushes it out. So in young, healthy adults like you all, because I know none of you smoke, you have no problem. All right? Moving air in and out is not a big deal. All right? But elasticity is not solely just that. It's based on something. It has two different components to it. It has to do, one, with the degree of elastin fibers that are located within the lungs. That's part of the connective tissue that we talked about in very brief terms when we said the lung is full of connective tissue. All right? So that's one. It has this elastin in it. But the other has to do with surface tension. All right? Now, I'm going to steal a little bit of water here. I'm going to try to do this without splashing myself like I do in other classes. Okay, so I've collected a little bit of water here. All right, and I got a leaky tight junction. All right, I don't need a lot of water. When I take this water and put it on this counter, is it going to spread out one molecule thin? What's it going to do? Now, I know the people in the back can't see this. All right, I mean, it's just basically a big thing. I mean, even from here, it's not that great. I know, it's really hard. But if you were to come up real close and look at it, what you're going to see is it looks like this, right? On the surface, it is, here's the surface, and then what I have is this kind of bubble, right? And the reason we have this bubble is because water is a bunch of hydrogen bonds that basically are attracted to one another, and so all the water molecules are basically attracted and basically try to create this bubble on the surface instead of trying to just escape from each other and diffuse out as far as possible, right? This causes surface tension. So, have you ever taken water and put it on a piece of paper? What happens when you put water on paper? What happens to the paper? Water gets absorbed in the paper and the paper curls, right? And the reason it curls is because, again, the water molecules are attracted to one another because of the hydrogen bond, and so they drag with it, the water molecules drag with it the parts of the paper that have been inserted into and try to draw them closer together. Now, this is also true what happens in the lungs, in the alveolus. Here's your alveolus. You put the drop of water inside your lungs because they're attracted to all the water molecules attracted to one another. They draw the sides of the alveoli closer and closer together. And then what happens to the alveolus, instead of being in this nice, happy shape like, oh, look at me, I'm a nice round thing, what happens is this water bubble draws this in this direction, draws that in that direction, and then what you end up with is, I should do it like that, is this thing that looks like a collapsed balloon. And what do we know about collapsed balloons? They can't hold air, and it sucks to blow them up. Right? Alright. Now this is a hard example for me to give, but it's the easiest one I can think of, and so for those of you who do not get me, just trust me on this. For those of you who have ever worked in a laboratory, have you ever had to clean glass plates? And when the two glass plates get stuck together, is it easy to separate them? No. Why? Because of the hydrogen bonding and everything we just described. It takes you, what you have to do is you can't separate the plates this way. You have to twist the plates until you get some separation, then you can break them apart. Now, for those of you who didn't understand that, I get it. That's fine. All right? But this becomes a problem. Because when you're breathing in and out, one of the ways that water escapes your body is through your lungs. And so you actually have a lot of water that's actually a vapor sitting inside your lungs, and it begins to coat the inside of the alveoli, which causes them to do just like that. So here we have a problem. The alveoli themselves, with water in the alveoli, begins to become an issue with regard to elasticity. So, what we're doing is we're going to constrict our alveoli, which is bad. We don't want that. And so to counter that, that's where we need surfactants. Now, I love throwing this up there because this makes everybody panic. Yeah, you look at, more physics. The law of Laplace. And what the law of Laplace basically says is, look, the inward pressure is equal to twice the tension divided by the radius. Huh? Am I going to ask you the math? No, I'm not even going to ask you the equation. All right? I'm talking about this so that you understand the problem. All right? Because our alveoli are not universally the same size. Some are small, some are big. All right? And tension can result from water. Right? So naturally they want to collapse in the first place. The other thing is that if you have different sized alveoli, when air fills into them, they can only expand so much. In other words, the inward pressure is going to be dependent on their radius. And so even though you bring in air, what happens is as air fills into both of these things, it's going to fill up here very, very quickly and create this pressure that is then greater than the pressure of a larger alveoli. And if you have a pressure gradient, what's air going to want to do? Go to high to low. And so as the pressure in here is greater than in here, air moves out, and what's going to happen to that little tiny alveolus? It's going to collapse. And if you have a collapsed alveolus, what you've done is you've reduced the surface area through which you can actually exchange gases. So, surfactant deals with these two issues. First, it gets in between these water molecules. It separates them all out and prevents them from interacting. And so if they can't interact, they can't draw the walls of the alveolus together and cause them to collapse. In other words, the air that you breathe in and the air that you push out basically just causes you to get this partial collapse. You don't get a complete collapse. But the other thing that it does is that it reduces the tension inside those smaller alveoli so that you equilibrate pressures in large and small alveoli. So as air comes in, that tension here and the tension here are roughly the same. So this expands at roughly the same rate as that one without affecting pressure. Now this isn't about the math, and I don't want you to sit there and start calculating and wait a second, what tension do I need? No, it's the principle that's important here. What the surfactant is trying to do is to ensure that we have equilibrated pressure so that we can maximize the surface area for gas exchange, which is ultimately what the goal of the lung is in the first place. Breathe in the air, have as much surface area as possible so I can move gases back and forth. Mm-hmm.
How much variation is there in size?
I don't imagine that there's all that much, but remember, when you're talking about radii, just a little bit of difference in radius results in a lot in terms of surface area. Just to prove that point, which is it better to do? Order 2 medium pizzas or to order a large pizza? Why don't you go and do the math and find out? You'll actually find out. Yeah, there you go. Right, it's primarily a bunch of fat and proteins that basically sit between the waters and separate them. Yeah. Now, airflow in your airway is going to be dependent upon radius. Oh man, that's so easy. I mean, we've already learned this. Let's just forget these slides. I'm just teasing. We're talking about bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation. Autonomic nervous system plays a role. Bronchoconstriction is when we lose or decrease the radius, bronchoconstriction, all right? If you decrease the radius, you increase resistance. Simple enough. Right. How is this, and when does this take place? Well, the autonomic nervous system, the role in this is going to be parasympathetic. Now, this might seem counterintuitive to you, but it shouldn't. When you're sitting around on the sofa, eating popcorn and watching, oh, I don't know, what's a good show nowadays? Is it Walking Dead? Is that like the Breaking Bad? Yep. Breaking Bad. Huh? Okay, Walking Dead is more sympathetic. Actually, I saw a great infographic on Walking Dead. It was like 5 minutes of really, really cool story, 10 minutes of something stressful, 35 minutes of really, really boring story that gets us nowhere, 5 minutes of thriller at the very end to make me watch the next show. Yeah. I've not ever seen it. I apologize. Yeah. Anyway, but think about it. When you're sitting on the sofa doing absolutely nothing, do you need to get air into your lungs? No. So bronchoconstriction is good. It basically allows you, once you get the air inside your lung, it kind of traps it there. All right? And the local chemical control for this is your concentration of carbon dioxide. In other words, how much carbon dioxide do you have in the localized tissue inside the lungs? If it's really low, you're going to result in bronchoconstriction. Because if you have low carbon dioxide levels, what's the opposite? High oxygen levels. And do you want to breathe out high oxygen? No. It's trapping. So we're going to see bronchoconstriction. The converse is true with bronchodilation. This is increased radius, thus a decrease in the resistance to flow. That means we're bringing in air. Some sympathetic stimulation plays a role in this, but it's primarily through epinephrine where you see this, all right, which is also sympathetic in nature. And again, what are you trying to do? Sympathetic activity promotes, basically dealing with stress, right? Chased by lions, or whatever it is that stresses you out. And what you're doing here is you want to open those things up as much as possible to drive air in, bringing in oxygen, and to get rid of carbon dioxide as fast as you can because you're making it. And so you can imagine here I'm dealing with high levels of carbon dioxide. Now, what we haven't described yet, what we haven't talked about yet, which we're going to deal with on Thursday before the exam, is what is it that your body is actually watching to decide when it's time to breathe in and breathe out. And it's going to be your carbon dioxide levels. And it's actually more complex than that, so just ignore that for right now. Now, pulmonary ventilation is the amount of air that's breathed in and out of your body in 1 minute. All right? And it's equal to your tidal volume times your respiratory rate. Tidal volume is measured in mils per breath. Respiratory rate is number of breaths per minute. And then the mils per minute is how you're going to be looking at your pulmonary ventilation. Now, just doing the math tells you if I increase my tidal volume, I'm going to increase my pulmonary ventilation. If I increase my respiratory rate, I'm going to increase pulmonary ventilation. Math tells us that this is how things work, right? If I double either one of those things, I've doubled my pulmonary ventilation. Would you agree with that mathematically? Okay, good. Yes, we all understand the math. Problem is that it's more advantageous to increase our tidal volume than to increase respiratory rate. And the reason for that is because of the structures of the lungs. All right? What we have is we have an area of dead space. Can you guys see okay over there? Okay. Here is my bronchi. And you can imagine those divide into the secondary, tertiary, quaternary, down into the bronchioles. And then ultimately you get a whole bunch of alveoli, which basically make up the remainder of my lungs. Now, if presuming, of course, that my picture here of the lungs represents the amount of area through which I actually do gas exchange, and my little Y here, upside down right, represents all my bronchioles, you can see that there's a portion of my respiratory system that does not play a role in gas exchange. Would you agree with that? So basically, this plays no role in gas exchange. Right? Bronchioles, there's no gas exchange inside the bronchi or the bronchioles. It's only in the alveoli. But when I breathe in, does this fill up with air? Yes, it has to. Right? Because when I pull air in, it first comes in, goes down into the lungs, fills up the lungs, and then it backs up and fills up here so that everything is equilibrated. So the pressure out here, 760 millimeters of mercury. Pressure inside here is 760. Pressure inside here is 760 millimeters of mercury. If it wasn't full of air, what would happen? Air would move to it because it would have less pressure. Right? So everything gets filled up, but because gas exchange is only taking place here, all of the air that we brought into our bodies into that area is considered to be in dead space. So even though we move 500 mils of air into our lungs every time we breathe, a portion of that air plays no role whatsoever in gas exchange. It's stuck inside the bronchi and the bronchioles. That's the dead space. All right? So, when we breathe in, This is what this is trying to show you. When we breathe in, 500 mils comes in. The first 300 mils that we breathe in fills inside the lungs. And then 150 mils is basically stuck outside in that bronchi. And then when we breathe out, that's the very first thing we push out is 150 mils of unused air. And then we push a portion of that 350 mils back out, and then there's a portion that's stuck inside our lungs again. And then we push that back in when we breathe in, and so we're recycling air that we breathed in the first time. So you have stale air in your body. Ew. Just think after kissing somebody. Ew. And they ate onions. Ew. Okay, I'm just kidding. All right. So basically what we're saying is there is a volume of air that is not used in gas exchange that we need to take into account when it comes to pulmonary ventilation. And so really what we're saying is that the amount of air that gets into the alveolus, the alveolar ventilation, and this is including all the alveoli, is equal to your tidal volume minus your dead space volume. All right? Now, to show you why this is important and why it becomes important to regulate tidal volume as opposed to respiratory rate, is we're going to look at what happens when we modify respiratory rate but keeping tidal volume constant. All right? Actually, we're going to be keeping total pulmonary ventilation constant. So we're just going to muck with one of the numbers and keep coming up with the same thing. All right? So remember what we said. Alveolar ventilation is equal to the tidal volume minus the dead space times the respiratory rate. And we're saying monitoring or mucking with that is more important than mucking with this when it comes to breathing. So we're going to keep this volume, this ventilation, mils per minute, constant. So, here's my tidal volume. Here's my ventilation rate. So, normal breathing, 500 mils per minute, times 12 gives me my total pulmonary ventilation of 6,000. But we said, remember, that we lose 150 mils with every breath because it's stuck in our bronchi. So we really are actually breathing in only 350 mils of air that are usable. And so 350 times 12 gives us 4,200 mils per minute. So really, even though we think we're getting 6,000 mils per minute, we're only getting 4,200 mils per minute. All right? That's our baseline. What happens if we increase our respiratory rate? We start breathing very, very quickly. All right? Oh, this is so sad. They've changed my numbers for me. Oh, we'll do this. We'll start with the 300. 300 times 20 gives us 6,000. All right? But here we go. We have 150 we lose. So 300 minus 150 is 150 times our 20 gives us 3,000. We're getting a lot less air just by speeding up, right? Well, if we go with deep and slow things down, again, we lose 150, but 600 times 8 gives us 4,800. Deep breaths gets us more air, even though we slowed down. Now, I tried to show you something here. What if I do 150 mils per breath, but I'm really just pumping it like mad? Right? 150 mils with 40 breaths per minute. Right? But if I only get 150 mils into my lungs, or in per breath, and I mean 150 are stuck in the dead pace, 150 minus 150 is 0 times 40 is, and what happens when you hyperventilate for extended periods of time? You don't die, you pass out. Remember, that's the fun party trick, right? You know, get someone to sit down and then have them stand up and watch them go. Yes. Well, it happens at parties regardless of whether or not you're hyperventilating. You know, but do you see the difference here? Now, obviously, we don't keep this value, straight. I mean, when you're running a race, do you keep your respiration constant? No, your respiratory rate goes up, but so does your tidal volume. Both of them do. So it's a simultaneous effect to increase it. But what does the coach tell you to do? Teaches you when they're training you. Deep breaths, deep breaths, deep breaths. And this is because it's more advantageous. It moves more air into your lungs, which means you move more oxygen into your lungs, which makes you happier. Now, there's also something called alveolar dead space, and this is what we're going to deal with these last two pictures on the board here. Alveolar dead space is actually rather simple. You guys have very few, all right? What alveolar dead space is alveoli that do not pay or participate in gas exchange, primarily because of bad things that happen to them like this, when they collapse or for whatever reason. They don't stretch real well, all right? But the purpose of alveolar dead space, or a way to counter alveolar dead space, is to move oxygen or move blood to where gas exchange can actually take place. In other words, we can also think of alveolar dead space as those areas where gas exchange has occurred and it can no longer occur because we've already met the conditions for the movement of the gases. All right, want that in English? Okay, when you have equalized pressure in the alveolus and equalized pressure in the blood, is gas exchange going to occur? No. So, what you want to do is you want to maximize and ensure that that never occurs. All right? So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to match airflow to blood flow. And so what alveolar dead space is not dealing with macro movement of air. We're dealing with micro movement of air. So at any given time, each alveolus is going to be controlled at the local level. All right? The local controls. Now, I hate the way I titled these two slides, because carbon dioxide is the thing that plays the biggest role in all of this stuff. That's what we're going to be looking at. But I want you to think of it. So when you're looking at these, don't go, what is the effect of carbon dioxide? Look at this thing right here. What happens when perfusion or blood flow is greater than, ventilation? I was stuck on the word. Or airflow. Here we are. Blood returning to the lungs is going to have more or less carbon dioxide than oxygen. More. And theoretically, blood leaving the lungs is going to have more oxygen than carbon dioxide. So what that means is carbon dioxide should be lower here, and oxygen should be greater here. Right? This is what would happen. So we expect carbon dioxide to go this direction. We expect oxygen to go that direction. And what this question asks is, what happens when our blood flow is greater than our airflow? In other words, what has happened? I should probably put an arrow showing here that oxygen comes this direction and carbon dioxide moves out. So what happens when all this carbon dioxide that's being delivered starts filling up here? In other words, the carbon dioxide levels go up, and because oxygen is being removed, oxygen levels go down. We're going to start seeing balance, right? So what we want to do is we want to prevent carbon dioxide from arriving, and we want to get rid of carbon dioxide, right? Would you agree with that? All right. Just to make sure that I'm making it clear here. So I'm going to just put a transition in here. So what's happened is that carbon dioxide levels are equal now here, and our oxygen levels are basically equal there. All right, so what do we want to do? Well, let's get rid of the carbon dioxide. Let's draw that out. So we bronchodilate, right? So our carbon dioxide leaves, right? So our high carbon dioxide levels leave, and that allows for oxygen to come in. See that? And at the same time, we vasoconstrict. By vasoconstricting, we've prevented carbon dioxide from coming in, so we don't see the movement of carbon dioxide in. We've lost that. We've prevented it from happening. At the same time, we've prevented oxygen from leaving, but because we've already equilibrated with the blood, it doesn't matter. All right? All we're doing now is we're trying to create an environment that is conducive to gas exchange. And that's what we've lost, because we've delivered all the oxygen and we got back all the carbon dioxide. So what happens is now we've gotten to the point where we get all this gas exchange taking place, And now we end up with a whole bunch of oxygen and very little carbon dioxide. But now we're not exchanging gas. Right? So what we have to do is the next step is when we have a lot of oxygen. That's what the next step is. All right? So again, when ventilation is greater than perfusion, then we go and do the reverse. I'll come and draw it over on that side too. All right? So here, what have we done? We've bronchoconstricted. We've trapped our oxygen inside. We don't have a lot of carbon dioxide. We don't care that we have very little carbon dioxide. But what we do is we vasodilate. That way we can get that carbon dioxide to be delivered, and we can get rid of that oxygen. And then what we're going to do is we're going to keep going backwards and forwards, or I should say back between each of these two states. See, we're bringing in the oxygen to replace the oxygen that we lost. We opened it up, bronchodilated, so we can get rid of the carbon dioxide that has been built up. We don't deliver because we have vasoconstricted. And then once we've delivered all the oxygen so that this is no longer low, but it's now high, and this is no longer high, it's now low, what we've done is we're going to bronchoconstrict to trap that high levels of oxygen, and we don't care about that. And what's going to happen is carbon dioxide is going to be delivered, oxygen is going to be exchanged. And so we're going to be moving through these two states over and over again. And this is done at the local level. This does not take into consideration the whole system. So you can have two alveoli side by side where one is bronchoconstricted and one is bronchodilated. That makes sense? Because it's all about what's going on inside this particular alveolus. And if you think about it, and I'm just going to go ahead and just jump back a whole bunch of slides, just so you can see what it is that I'm describing here. Yeah, I knew it. I was going to confuse it. Poor, slow, dumb little computer. Doesn't understand anything. Alright, fine. And then we'll be done. This will be it. And you'll be so excited. It amazes me that this computer is so slow. Seriously. I mean, look, I've just... It doesn't know what it's doing. Please, oh please. There you are. Yeah. Goodbye. Goodbye. What I wanted to show you is just the alveolus. I wanted you to see what it looks like. Now, of course, I've got to reset everything, which is going to just tick me off to no end, but I want you to see that. Look at those capillaries. Look how it looks. I mean, do you see how each of these alveolus have their own little capillaries surrounding them? And that's why it's able to go through this process of local control. Make sure that each one of them does exactly what it needs to do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, you can imagine that's the level, that's what's going on here. Now, how big is this capillary bed and how many alveoli are covered through per capillary bed? You got me. I don't know the answer to that. But you can imagine it's not going to be very many. And in fact, when you think about capillaries just in general, it's not like your capillary bed in your face is one capillary bed. Yeah. All right. So it's really, you can imagine there, I thought it was a student from one of those, hey, what's up? You know, you can imagine that there's multiple capillary beds that cover multiple, little tiny itsy bitsy patches of area. All right. Yeah, or it could be like 2 alveoli or 3 alveoli, very, very small amount. And this is true throughout all the body with regard to the capillaries. They don't cover these vast expanses. They're little itsy bitsy tiny areas. So it's just kind of breaking it down so that you can deliver blood very quickly and very efficiently to wherever you need to do. And that's what's going on here. It's very efficient, very clean, very quick. Now when we come back, that was the last thing I was going to talk about. I think that was the last thing. I should probably, let's see if we can crash it one more time. Probably not. There we go. Look. Yeah, so when we get back, we're going to do our last little lecture on the respiratory system, and we're going to deal with these partial pressures and what the role of the partial pressures is in regard to getting the oxygen to our cells and how we go about doing that. Have an enjoyable Tuesday. Drive safe in the dark.
Compliance?
Yeah, it basically cooks your lungs like smoking a turkey or
It basically shrinks it.
No, what it does is basically causes the fibers to bind together. Alright? So go look at a piece of meat. Go buy a piece of meat and hold it in your hand and see what it does. Does it flop around? Is it real floppy? Yeah, it is. Go take not a frozen piece of meat, just a
talking about the ribs again.
just a piece of meat. Like a chicken breast, right?
Uncooked and stuff?
Yeah, an uncooked one. And then when you cook it, what happens? It gets hard and sticky because what you've done is you've crossed what's called proteins. You cause them to basically solidify and basically link to each other. Right? And then what happens is you further cook it even further, then you break those, and then the meat starts falling apart, which is why when you have a pot roast, if you get a really good pot roast that falls apart, right? The whole pork, and you cook it long enough, it falls apart. So what you're doing is you're basically cross-linking. So what I'm saying is when you smoke, you're smoking your lungs just like you smoke any sort of meat. So it creates those cross-links, which creates the lungs, prevents the lungs from expanding manually out.
Like, so it makes it stiff and hard, and everything is
That's
bad.
exactly right.
And then when you're talking about the dead space, so the excess air that never gets used is always stuck in the bronchioles and stuff.